afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our call today on resisting Operation Relentless Pursuit. My name is Angelyn Frazer-Giles, and I am the Executive Director of the National Network for Justice. The National Network for Justice is a national organization that seeks to support state-based organizations who are looking at decarceration efforts in jails, prisons, and detention facilities. We have a committee called the Committee for Intersectional Mobilization that has been working on ORP and trying to resist the efforts of the U.S. Attorney General in this unfortunate endeavor. So today I want to first thank Laura Sager and Judy Green, who are the co-chairs of this committee and who've helped bring all of these remarkable people together today that are going to talk about the issue as well as talk about the mobilization efforts that they are doing in their jurisdictions. So I'm also going to be fielding questions from the audience. So if you have a question, send it directly to me, Angelyn Frazer-Giles, and I will then feed them to our moderator today, who is Joia Thornton, and I will let Joia introduce herself. But please make sure that if you have a question, if it's for a specific person, you can put it in the chat and I will make sure to get it to Joia. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Joia so she can talk a little bit about herself and what she's doing and how we are going to be formatted today for this webinar. So thank you again for joining us. And I will also make sure to put my email. So if you have questions after the fact, I will be glad to try to assist you in getting some of your questions answered or helping you assist you in becoming an NJ member. So thank you. And Joia, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Angelyn, and thank you to all of you who have made time to join us here on this call for this webinar. I want to say good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you land in our time zone. I am Joia Erin Thornton, one of the lead organizers against Operation Relentless Pursuit in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm also a project manager at Just City Memphis, which is a criminal justice reform organization. I am also an organizer and advocate against Tennesseans for alternatives to the death penalty in the state. On behalf of the 7 City Collective, I would like to welcome you to this communications webinar. We hope to make the best use of everyone's time today, and we really just want to share learnings from city to city, get to know one another, and really be able to collaborate and build power together. Many of you may be familiar with the coordination efforts against Operation Relentless Pursuit in the 7 designated cities, but for those who are not, on Wednesday, December 18th, 2019, a memo was released by the Department of Justice by Attorney General William Barr to launch an initiative by the name of Operation Relentless Pursuit. This was aimed at combating violent crime in what the DOJ believed to be America's most violent cities, okay? These cities are Albuquerque, Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, Memphis, and Milwaukee. Under ORP, tactics involve increasing the number of federal law enforcement and/or resources, and a $71 million grant to be broken down based on the municipality's need or predictive analytics from crime data in that area. Now, I want you all to just indulge me for a few moments to briefly share the breakdown of funding by city. And if you're keeping notes, I will send a line item out by request if you miss a couple of numbers. So these documents are based on the line item budget that was released May 11th, 2020. Now, if this data has been updated and if you have more information from your city or updated information from your city, please share in the chat or inform the larger coordinating committee on what has been going on. But based on the May 11th, 2020 line item budget, it goes as follows. Albuquerque PD, $9,740,029. Bernalillo County, $1 million, $536,750. Baltimore PD, $2,830,272. Cleveland PD, $7,968,944. Ohio State PD, $1,281,658. The Division of Parole, this is still Ohio, $752,014. Detroit PD, $2,474,706. Kansas PD, Missouri, $3,675,522. Kansas City, Kansas, $1,322,150. Memphis PD, $9,823,624. Shelby County Sheriff, this is still Tennessee, $1.4 million. Milwaukee PD, $9,712,096. Wauwatosa PD, $226,061. And finally, Cudahy PD, $3,001 for $414. So again, if there are any questions that arise from this discussion, please place them in the chat. Again, if it's updated information on your particular city's budget, please inform us of that. I am now going to pass it to our first speaker, Yvonka Hall, who is the Executive Director of the Northeast Black Health Coalition, and she will share how the movement is going in Cleveland and then pass it along to her colleague, 20-year organizer, Avery, and founding member of SURJ, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Ohio. Yvonka?
Hi, how are you all doing? So I am going to give you a historical overview of kind of the policing system in the country, and then when we get to the ORP, Avery will explain some of those pieces. But I think that it's important for us always to talk about the past, because then that sets the tone for the things that are going on now, and then what were some of the solutions that were put into place then, or supposed to be put in place, that were never put into place. And then when we're looking at how we're handling this policing system and the fact that the militarization of our police with zero accountability. So slave patrols, 1704, South Carolina. And I can remember my great-grandfather, who was born in 1900, calling them patty rollers. And so that was their nickname. They were patty rollers, which was the patrol officers, which was what it became short for. The 13th Amendment, looking at those things and saying, okay, how do we take the 13th Amendment, which was to say that slavery is abolished, but now create a new form of slavery? And so those things are important to people, and to people who really don't understand and grasp the whole contextual placement of police and what it means to the African-American community, and why we talk about the defunding of the policing commissions and the police offices across the country. The other thing, the next important thing in our history around policing would be the Kerner Commission report. You know, the Kerner Commission report was issued on February the 29th, 1968. It talked about the egregious issues that were going on with the police after there were more than 150 riots that took place across the country. And so within those riots, it was, you know, what is going on with the community that's rioting. And so what they looked at is white racism. Just spelled it out. This is what the report says. And it sparked the spark of violence. They looked at it as not a conspiracy by African-American political groups, as some claim, which we see the same things now. they did the same thing with the Black Panthers to say, the Black Panthers, they're a radical leftist group that's going against the police. And we look at the same thing that's going on now with the Black Lives Matter movement, being portrayed as a terrorist group instead of a group that's actually looking at how to dig down in policy and create policies that actually work for African Americans. It also identified the role of police officers and what they played in the radical disorders that took place. So they looked at policing and said that policing symbolized white power, white racism, and white repression. And the fact is that many police officers do reflect and express these attitudes. And we look at the same thing today, around the attitude of police officers. How do they not understand the difference between what they're doing and what's happening, like the reality, the real and the Memorex, what's going on with their logic and thinking when they're looking at arrests or when they're looking at charging of African Americans, and then the belief among African Americans of the existence of police brutality, and a double standard of justice and protection, one for Negroes and one for whites. Remember that this was written in 1968. So in 1968, in February of 1968, I was just a few months old. And so this is something that has gone on with us my whole life. So in 1968, in November of 1968, my uncle was murdered by the police here in Cleveland. The police came to a domestic violence incident at a former girlfriend's house, and he had went there with his new girlfriend to see if she was okay. And the police murdered him in her front yard. And then a few months later, my uncle's best friend, who was a 19-year-old young man whose mom called the police because he was drunk and arguing with his stepfather, and the police shot him in the back in his kitchen. And so we have to look at the ramifications, the things that happen with the police, and what happens with our community. And so one of the things that the Kerner Commission also talked about was it condemned the moves to equip police departments with mass destructive weapons, automatic rifles, machine guns, tanks, the demilitarization of police. So it talked about the demilitarization of police in 1968. And it talked about looking at these weapons as weapons designed to destroy, not to control, that they have no place in densely populated urban areas. And so that's important for us to understand too. It's like, how do we go from we don't need this to now putting millions and billions with the Crime Act, put millions with the crime bill, it put billions of dollars into the militarization of police and the changing of the justice systems. And so that would be the next piece. So the crime bill of 1994, what happened with that and what happened with African Americans with that? It provided 100,000 new police officers. They received $9.7 billion in funding for prisons, $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs. I don't know what those prevention programs were. And then the impact of the crime bill, looking at it beyond the crime bill. And so for the African American community, we've always looked at it beyond the crime bill because we looked at the economic impact on our communities. We looked at the educational impact, the public health systems, and the well-being and the resilience of our community. We had a crime bill that looked at things as 100 to 1. So that was the sentencing guidelines, 100 to 1. So Black people got 100 times the sentence of white people to their 1. And now when they actually changed the bill, it's still 18 to 1. And so you change it to make it equitable, and it's still not equitable. Just make it right. And so the Center for American Progress talked about that and talked about some of the 3 ways that the crime bill continue to impact the African American community. And that'll lead us into the Operation Relentless Pursuit. So the one way was it authorized the death penalty for 60 new federal offenses. The other is that it imposed a mandatory life sentence for individuals with 3 or more felonies. But the one that we look at now that's actually how this Operation Relentless Pursuit is going to play out is it levied harsh new penalties for justice that involved youth, right? So the bill also called for sentencing enhancements for youth who are convicted of certain offenses and believed to be associated with gangs. However, while white youth represent a significant portion of self-identified gang members at 40%, law enforcement report that more than 90% of gang members are people of color. So if white teens, white youth identify 40%, say that they're gang members, how do you come about this 90% that gang members are people of color? It's something, an illusion that you create in your head so that you can say we can now have a war on young people. And basically that is what Operation Relentless Pursuit is. It is a new way to lock up the African-American community and lock them up out of opportunities for the remainder of their life. It also, in this crime bill, it says prosecutors were more likely to target people of color for suspected gang association. And so in conclusion with that, with the crime bill, well, in conclusion of the crime bill, one of the things that we wanted to do with that crime bill and what we gathered from the crime bill over these years is we needed to work at dismantling the harmful policies, enact comprehensive public safety solutions, reduce resilience, reliance on incarceration, prevent unnecessarily criminalization, and eliminate the draconian laws that are keeping African Americans in prison. Then we go back to the Justice Department. And so the Justice Department in Cleveland in December of 2014, they detailed the results of an investigation that they started in 2013. And it concluded that the Cleveland police engaged in a pattern of practice of unreasonable and in some cases unnecessary force of violence in the violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And so we looked at the murders that took place prior to then. We looked at the 137 shots that involved Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams, who were two innocent people who were gunned down by the police, the Cleveland police, chased down and gunned down in a school block here in Cleveland. We also look at Tanisha Anderson. So Tanisha Anderson was a mentally ill African-American woman whose family called for help. And when they called for help, the police came and strangled her to death in her driveway. And then Tamir Rice, which is one of the more notable that we talk about, was a young man who was in a park playing with a toy gun, who never presented a toy gun to the police, but within 2 seconds of the police arrival on the scene, they actually got out and gunned this young man down. And so one of the things that there was a man on Facebook who wanted to list the number of African Americans who had been murdered by the police. He actually created this list 2 weeks ago. And I asked him to add my uncle and my uncle's friend to the list. And right now for Cleveland, the list is at 150 that have been murdered by the police. And so that is important because when you associate the names with the acts, then it's not just saying the number, but it's saying these people have lost their life, lost their livelihood, and the impact on their families as a direct result of the police behavior. The other thing that came out of this policing issue in December of 2014 was the consent decree. And so the consent decree is a 5-year agreement that included 380 specific reforms, including new training on the use of force, protocols for reducing and responding to mentally ill and bias-free policing, and changes intended to hold the police more accountable. What has happened is nothing. So what we have gotten since 2014 is we spent a whole bunch of money for lip service. We have monitors that have made hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars since 2014. Now, mind you, I remember having a church tea. Yes, a church tea. And there was a monitor at our church tea. And I'm like, why are you here at a church tea for a bunch of African-American women? Well, I'm working as part of the monitoring team. Well, we're not committing any crimes, so you don't need to monitor a tea. And so this is the kind of frivolous actions that we see instead of actually doing the policy and making sweeping changes to our system. What we see is those changes being swept under the rug, the concerns of the community being washed away, and the community continually coming back and saying, when do we get justice? So what we need is people to ask for better use of training, use of force training and policies, more diverse police forces, more federal intervention by the Department of Justice to hold officers accountable for unnecessary use of force. So we don't need you to send in more police. We don't need you to send in more weaponry. We don't need you to increase the policing capacity. What we need you to do is increase your empathy with the community that you're seeking to serve. Make sure that you have not only culturally proficient, because cultural proficiency, because a lot of our police departments say that hey, we've attended some cultural competency trainings, but cultural competency is just understanding how systems work. So yeah, y'all understand y'all system work, and for us, it's jacked up. So what we need you to do is we need you to be culturally proficient. Cultural proficiency means you understand how people work. So that means that Dylan Roof went into a church and shot 9 people to death and went to Burger King, right? Tamir Rice, young man, walking in a park, not flashing anything at the time, ride up on him and kill him. So if you are culturally proficient, Tamir Rice would be here celebrating his 18th birthday, because you would have been culturally proficient. Instead of you riding up on the grass, right, you would have parked into a parking lot, got out of the car and talked to him and said, young man, so what's going on? You would have given him the same courtesy that you gave the young man who murdered 9 innocent people at a church. And then you took him to Burger King to get a Happy Meal, to get a Burger King meal. Right. So Dr. King once said this: we can never be satisfied as long as a Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Law and order exist for a purpose of establishing justice. And when they fail for this purpose, they become the dangerously constructed dams that block the flow of social progress. It is our job to unblock those dams, because the cure for trauma is justice.
Thank you so much, Yvonka. Before I pass it to you, Avery, I do want to follow up with Yvonka took us to school, everybody. And I think it's very important to know our history, because if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it, and what justice actually looks like and who justice really prevails for, which class of people justice really prevails for. Thank you so much for giving all of those examples and cases and really bringing it home personally to you and your story. I'm so glad that your uncle got added to that list and his friend. So I'm going to pass it to Angelyn right now. I believe we have a question, and there are also some really great discussions going on in the chat. So if you are an attendee, you have an opportunity to chat also with panelists as well, if they have time to chat right before they speak or right after. So I'm going to pass it to Angelyn to see what's going on in the chat, or do we have any good questions that we can speak to right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, which is great. I really appreciate folks chatting. I have a question. I had several questions for you, Yvonka, but because of the fact that when you started talking, I had one question, and by the end, I had several, but I'm just going to ask the one right now because I wanted to stay on time. What you were describing in the beginning sounds like COINTELPRO, and I was just wondering if you had any not suggestions, but any reflections on what is happening now to what was happening then, and how things just get reinstituted in a different form, right?
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's one of the things that we see with Operation Relentless Pursuit. We never did any of the things that we asked for, that people asked for all along, around changing the structures of policing. And changing them from what they were established to, which is basically the whole Black control of Black folks. And so when people start pushing for change instead of the change, like IntelPro, where they did all kinds of things on police, on people in the communities, what they do is they come out with a new version of it. So yeah, the crime bill is still impacting us. Like, people think that the crime bill is still not happening, but we're still paying for the crime bill right now. So we're still in the middle of the crime bill. And so what happened was that one objective of the crime bill, which was that war on youth, is what we're seeing now is this Operation Relentless Pursuit. So basically what they did was they said, oh, we haven't been able to do this because we need to keep our prisons populated because we have these private suppliers that we have told them that we're going to keep their jails full. And so we have to have a new way. So we can't go back and say people over 40 are committing crimes, okay? So what they need to do is they need to have a fresh new group of folks that are able to come in, and where they get them from is over sentencing young people and sentencing young people for adult crimes, even though they haven't committed adult crimes. So Intel Pro is definitely still alive and well in the African-American community. It just has the same game, new name.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for that. Nikichi Taifa, my colleague, and many of you know, we had this conversation just the other day about COINTELPRO. So as you were talking, it came to mind what we were talking about, because she's very, I mean, she was in the trenches from back in the day and she knows a lot about it. So I'm sure we'll get into some more of that discussion, but I will turn it back over to Joia.
Thank you, Angelyn. And thank you again, Yvonka. Like I said, you took us to school and back. So I'm going to pass it over to Avery with SURJ. Avery, what's going on?
Oh my goodness, it's such an honor to get to work with Yvonka here in Cleveland all the time. Like, what a brilliant powerhouse, and also a little intimidating to follow. So I'm just going to give some basic kind of overview of what our resistance operation Relentless Pursuit has looked like. So in hearing that this was being targeted towards the 7 most, deadly or violent cities in the United States, the first thing that we heard here in Cleveland is, oh, you mean you're going after the places that are most impacted by structural racism and have the least access to resources? Like, that's, when we're talking about violence, like the state-sanctioned violence, the violence of the police officers, I mean, that's the violence that folks in Cleveland are experiencing. The results of poverty that impact everyone's daily, day-to-day lives is the violence, the kind of like result of those conditions that people are forced to live in is what happens interpersonally. But our constant focus on that interpersonal violence as opposed to the systems that created it. So Cleveland is, for example, is number of our particularly Black neighborhoods are so like underinvested in, and not only underinvested in, but like resources stolen and for other communities, that are built up at their expense. And so if you look at for example, the history of redlining in Cleveland, the way in which government and banks created access to home loans. And they're actually, the Kirwan Institute on the study of race and ethnicity out of Columbus, Ohio, did a report on Cuyahoga, and they took the redlining maps and they overlaid them with other indicators of inequity, like air toxicity, rates of incarceration, lead poisoning, and all the neighborhoods that were initially redlined overlapped completely and perfectly with all the other experiences of inequity today. So if the state is really concerned about the violence in Cleveland, they're going to intervene at the same level at which they created the conditions of violence. Operation Relentless Pursuit is not that. It is not like retribution or resource allocation after decades of stealing from communities and investing in others. It's not good jobs. It's not like our lead poisoning is 3 times worse in Cleveland than in Flint. We have infant mortality rates in Black neighborhoods that are worse than on the Gaza Strip, which is a war zone. Like, those are the conditions that our people in Cleveland need help with, and that is not the help that they're going to get with Operation Relentless Pursuit. So it was just like very clear to us, those of us living on the ground in Cleveland, that the way they're talking about Cleveland makes completely invisible how Cleveland got to be where it's at. And so we just started, and what's also wild is that a number of us are working in deep relationship with each other. So Black Lives Matter Cleveland, Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, our local jail coalition that's fighting horrendous conditions at our county jail. We've all been really intimately connected to police accountability work, and yet the first we heard about this was actually from Laura with NNJ. And so it was wild how many people were directly like in this field of work, but it was kept so under wraps that OPR was coming for Cleveland. So we took our community groups and basically formed a coalition of individuals and leaders who were dedicated to pushing back against Operation Relentless Pursuit. This work is not only important for making sure this money doesn't land, but also important to the other campaign work that we have going on in Cleveland. So doing this deep dive into like the police budget and the research that we're doing is not only helpful for this work, but all the other work that we're doing too. And so we created working groups. We meet on Mondays for our full team meetings where we like share what we're doing, making, campaign next steps. But then the actual like kind of work of the committee happens in our working groups. And we have a communications working group and a research working group, feeling like those are the two biggest pieces that kind of need to be front loaded in any campaign. And so we've been really diving deep into FOIA and records requests, doing as much research as we possibly can on, why this is coming to Cleveland, who sets to benefit from it. We've gotten tremendous amounts of support from folks that are on this call that are part of our national kind of like team fighting Operation Relentless Pursuit in ways that have been just awesome, like really supporting local leadership. And supporting those of us on the ground here in Cleveland who are fighting back. So we're grateful to be part of this 7-city collaboration and feel like there's probably a lot of similarities between the conditions we're experiencing here and the conditions that other cities are facing. And we're ready to ensure that this money does not drop.
Thank you so much, Avery. As we can see, Ohio has hit the ground running, and Avery has been organizing for 20 years, and I didn't believe them, but after listening to all you had to offer to this conversation, it's just very important that you have your messaging in the 7 cities very airtight, and if you need support on that, that's what this webinar is for. Please reach out to us, and I'm sure any member of any of the cities who have hit the ground running will be able to offer that support for you, because this is very important. And our colleague Tony, she mentioned in the chat, same game, new name, 3 strikes, Jim Crow, Operation Relentless Pursuit. So I'm going to pass it to Alex Vitale, who is the host of YouTube's The Critical Criminologist and also the author of the 2017 The End of Policing. He's going to introduce himself a little bit more. I've been very, very impressed by how he has really been getting the message out about Operation Relentless Pursuit within the larger context of national recognition and conversations. So I'll pass it along to you now, Alex.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be joining this call and have been so impressed to see how this resistance has been mushrooming over the last few months, even as we get pulled in different directions by coronavirus and the uprising against abusive policing more broadly. So one of the things that I think is important here is to think about what's motivating this. Now, in many ways, as some have pointed out, there's nothing completely new about what we're seeing. There's a long history of these kinds of abusive federal, local partnership, task force interventions, and I'll talk a little bit about a couple of them in a minute. But I do think that every time we see a problem turned over to the police to manage, we need to ask ourselves, what is the political point behind that? What are the political failures? And also, what is the affirmative political project that's being driven by that? So it's clear that Operation Relentless Pursuit is part of the Trump campaign's re-election strategy, that this is part of their tough on crime agenda. And what's crucial here is that part of what they're trying to say is that the problems of cities like Cleveland and Detroit and Albuquerque and Memphis is not long-term deindustrialization, not the failure to provide federal support for housing, for infrastructure, for adequate health care. No, the problem is out-of-control young people, foreign cartels interfering in our cities, parents who aren't raising their kids properly, right? They want to frame the problems of urban America and of Black communities in particular, and brown communities and indigenous communities, as being the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to these kinds of abusive, punitive, coercive, violent interventions. And it's through that turning of the problems of these communities over to the police that we see racial inequality worsened in the United States. Because the problems of more well-off, whiter communities are not turned into criminal justice problems in this way. They get dealt with in other, less punitive ways. So it's clear that Trump wants to frame the problems of these communities as problems of crime to be solved by ever more intensive and invasive policing. So they're going to throw these federal law enforcement agencies that have a long history of abuse, corruption, misconduct, lack of transparency, or accountability, and no accountability, right? Look, the ATF, a notorious agency that has avoided any kind of oversight or consequences for incredibly mismanaging all kinds of things, going back to Ruby Ridge, the Waco siege, the giving of weapons over to cartels in hopes of tracking the weapons, and then the trackers only had a range of 20 miles and they just disappeared into the Mexican countryside. The use of informants who are themselves the perpetrating outrageous violence and gun running and things like this. The DEA in which agents are routinely arrested for drug violations, who are taking money from drug cartels, who are going off on junkets with prostitutes and private airplanes. This is somehow the agency that's going to save our cities. Even the FBI has a long history of racism, of overreach, of turning every problem in poor communities into problems to be solved by mass incarceration. So we should look at these agencies with deep suspicion that these are not going to be the tools that are going to solve the very real problems that these cities face. We do have problems of violence. We do have problems of drug overdoses. These are real problems. But the DEA, the ATF, the FBI have never been tools of solving those problems. They've been tools of serving their political masters by framing the problems of America as problems of those people being criminals. And let's just look at a couple of examples. Operation Flytrap around 2000 in Los Angeles was one of these big federal local partnerships to get the gangbangers, the drug dealers, the gun carriers. They came in and did a long-term operation. They did surveillance, they did buy and bust operations. They picked off the little people and tried to turn them against the big people. At least that's what they say in theory. But what we see in these operations is that there are never any big people, in part because the drug business just doesn't work that way. It's incredibly decentralized, and it is not organized into these neat pyramid hierarchies that we see on television. Mostly, people know someone who's in about the same situation they're in. They're buying relatively small amounts of drugs and passing them on to other people, sometimes themselves, sometimes they're using the drugs with someone else. And then the only person they can afford on is another poor person who either has a drug problem or a job problem. And what ends up happening is that these operations just criminalize a whole group of very poor people with very few resources who mostly have job problems and drug problems. In New York, we had Operation Crew Cut, which has involved the large-scale arrests of so-called criminal enterprises tied to what they call gangs. We don't really have gangs in that sense in New York, but they've created this hysteria about gangs. The local federal prosecutor working with the NYPD has spent years of surveillance, intelligence gathering, keeping lists and databases, and then rounding up large numbers of young people in a particular housing development or surrounding neighborhood and saying, we got this massive criminal enterprise and we've wiped them out and that's going to solve all the problems. What we really see is that most of these young people didn't know each other more than casually, that over half of them, the government itself, when it came time to bring charges, said they weren't in a gang. They couldn't provide any evidence they were in a gang. That about half of the people arrested, the ultimate charge they ended up with had to do with marijuana. Some of them were living in other states, were enrolled in colleges, were getting on with their lives, and are pulled back into federal prison and have their lives ruined as a result. Almost none of the young people arrested as part of the supposed criminal enterprise could afford a private lawyer. Almost every single one of them had to rely on a public defender. They didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, much less be the heads of some kind of criminal enterprise. Operation Flytrap, they made a big thing about, we've dropped crime, gang crime has fallen significantly, but when researchers went in and looked carefully, what they found is that actual violent crime in the neighborhood increased. It was just that they didn't call that new crime gang related. So who decides whether or not a crime is gang related? The police, who are taking credit for reducing gang crime. So they just classified things as not gang related after the raid, said gang crime had gone down, when in fact the level of violent crime in the community went up. And of course, nobody after either of these raids went 5 minutes without access to any kind of drugs they wanted. The idea that this kind of anti-drug policing is producing public safety or public health is just ludicrous. No lives have been saved. No one has been prevented from getting drugs, and instead we're just driving more and more young people of color into the criminal justice system. This is not the solution that Cleveland, Baltimore, Memphis, and Milwaukee want for their communities. They want access to real employment opportunities. They want an end to housing discrimination. They want better funding for their schools. They want job opportunities for their young people. They want to break the cycle of addiction and violence through counseling, drug treatment, trauma services. These are the things that produce strong, healthy, resilient communities, not over policing and mass incarceration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Even in moderation and moderating the panel, I am learning so much from each of you, and I hope that all of our attendees are learning as well, and panelists as well. Thank you so much, Alex, for identifying some of these challenges, but not just identifying, also offering solutions. Solutions to what these cities really need, Memphis included, Baltimore, Kansas City, Albuquerque, Cleveland, Baltimore, what these cities need. So that's very important, that while we are identifying what's going on in these communities, we're also offering the solutions as well. I just want to say thank you to everyone for participation in the webinar and chat. And there's also a Q&A feature at the bottom if you guys want to participate that way. And I hope that each of you are continuing the resistance in your own individual cities. If you are supporting a particular city, I just want you to know that there is a nationwide collective standing behind you in solidarity. So I'm going to pause and pass it to Angelyn if we have any comments in chat or questions with the Q&A feature.
Sure. So this question, Alex, you may be able to answer before you have to hop off, but this is coming from someone in Albuquerque, Francesca Bueller in Albuquerque, and says, did cities have to use the money if they were awarded it, or could they choose not to use it? from Albuquerque, and it looks like they used it for hiring more police officers and that it was in police department's control. So could you answer that? I know each city is a little bit different, but in terms of the mandate of how they had to spend the money and how many cities have received the money already and have already utilized it for these purposes.
You bet. So cities had to apply for the money. Now, I think what happened here was that the Justice Department already knew the cities it wanted to target. They had already arranged something with the local U.S. Attorney's Office, and then they went to the cities and said, put an application together and we'll give you money to do this. And so those applications specify how the money is to be spent. So cities could decide to give the money back, but they can't reallocate the money to something else. That's the short answer to that. And let me just say also, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a sign-on letter that's a national sign-on letter to try to bring pressure at the national level to end this funding for Operation Relentless Pursuit.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I urge all of the participants to go into the chat and really view the sign-on letter so that you can participate. I've received a lot of comments from youth who are in the cities, and youth, we need you. You are our soldiers. So definitely we want to offer some solutions to you on how you can support Operation Relentless Pursuit in your 7 cities. So let's go over to Baltimore, and we will now hear from Vanessa Beck, who serves on the research team and coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, Baltimore. She is also a member of the Ujima People's Progress Party. Vanessa, what's going on in Baltimore?
Thank you. Thank you, Joia. In Baltimore, since we found out about Operation Relentless Pursuit, when I say we, I mean Black Alliance for Peace Baltimore members and Ujima People's Progress Party members. We wrote a press release, and then Erica, who will also be speaking with us in a little bit, wrote a longer article about Operation Relentless Pursuit. And then we decided to do a teach-in to let community members know about this and how it relates to what we are already dealing with in Baltimore with regards to policing and why we need to oppose this. Then we held a second virtual teach-in a few weeks ago. We had about 50 people on that meeting, and it was just before that we learned about this national Resist ORP coalition. And we've also begun outreach to other local groups that we think may be interested in organizing with us around this issue and other issues of domestic repression. So policing has been so violent and corrupt here, even by the state's standards, that the Baltimore Police Department was placed under a consent decree as well. This was after their particularly inhuman treatment of Black residents during the 2015 uprisings after the police murdered Freddie Gray. And unfortunately, all this consent decree effectively does is serve as an acknowledgement that some kind of wrong was done. There's even, I think, the implicit hope there that everyone would just calm down and let them handle it. But what I learned about the consent decree, I have to thank Ujima People's Progress Party, and particularly Brandon Walker, who has a great analysis on this. And Ujima declared, we have no confidence in the BPD monitoring team with their conflicts of interest. And, obviously the police have continued to abuse and kill, to set people up, to terrorize us, to split families up, and so on. And yet this same police department that has been deemed corrupt, even by the Department of Justice, has been gifted money for more cops and more power. via Operation Relentless Pursuit. And yeah, there are, one of the things that we are concerned about regarding policing in Baltimore is the use of surveillance, because Baltimore historically has used, facial recognition, drones, things like this to track protesters and others who they believe have committed, some so-called crime. I saw a drone over my head at a protest a few weeks ago. I still haven't figured out whose drone that even is. When I went to just the aquarium a bit ago, to enter, there are these facial recognition infrared temperature check machines. And Baltimore has a privately funded spy plane that started its official test run in May. It captures around 32 square miles of the city per second, and I'm gonna show a really short video about that. It's 2 minutes long.
What if cameras recorded everywhere you went from the moment you stepped outside? Spy planes have the ability to do just that, carrying high-resolution cameras that can record every square inch of a city, subjecting residents to constant surveillance. This surveillance is powerful enough to change society, and it's a violation of our constitutional right to privacy. But in Baltimore, the police department is deploying an aerial surveillance program with a company called Persistent Surveillance Systems, which will let spy planes fly over the city for at least 40 hours per week, video recording everyone's outdoor movements. The company will make the recordings available to the Baltimore Police Department to use in criminal investigations. These recordings are detailed enough to give police the ability to go back in time to track pedestrians and vehicles across the city. They can also be linked to surveillance video from ground-based cameras and license plate readers, letting police identify people and see everywhere they go and who they interact with. This kind of tracking is an invasive search into people's movements without a warrant, and an infringement on their rights of association, a violation of the Fourth and First Amendments. Persistent aerial surveillance can reveal an enormous amount about us, including lifestyle data, like what kind of doctors we visit, whether we attend political protests, and how often we go to AA meetings. This is a power no American government has ever had or should have. Persistent Surveillance Systems knows this data is valuable. They want to sell it to anyone willing to pay, from insurance companies to police departments across the country. The Baltimore Police Department's decision to put residents under continuous aerial surveillance will affect the privacy rights of everyone, but it's especially dangerous for Black and brown residents of Baltimore and any other large city where the program might go next. Law enforcement has secretly used aerial surveillance technology in Black and brown communities before, including to monitor Black Lives Matter protesters in Baltimore. And right now, Baltimore is under a federal consent decree for routinely violating people's constitutional rights. Baltimore's police have a terrible history of racism and lack of accountability for abuses.
So yeah, that has been in the sky, along with the police helicopters. And so one thing that this plane will be used for, in addition to what we heard about in the video, is helping to turn Baltimore into what's called a smart city. And smart as in rigging the city up with smart technology. And this is packaged to sound like a great thing that will make everyone's life easier and more fun. But of course, that's rarely, if ever, the goal of the neoliberal capitalist technocratic state. Baltimore actually won a 2019 Readiness Challenge Award by the Smart Cities Council, and 3 goals that Baltimore states are improving digital city services, expanding education and workforce development, and improving public security. But what this actually means is a city that's even more equipped with a network of smart cameras, sensors, internet covering the whole city that can be used by government, police, private corporations to monitor people and all activity 24/7 for a myriad of reasons, mainly for intensified control of the population, further criminalization of the Black population, working class population, and for profit. And some of this technology is already in place, such as I think there are about 800 City Watch cameras in Black neighborhoods. And both the technology and the tech, we have to thank the Deadly Exchange program for that. And that's the police exchange with US and Israeli police. And they share basically their most genocidal and terrorizing practices with each other. Yeah, that's one thing that that we have our eye on and are learning more about. And Erica is going to talk about some more policing issues in Baltimore next.
Hi, everyone. So what I want to talk about is what happens when we survive the police. So I'm going to talk about the case of Keith Davis Jr. That is a case that's happening here in Baltimore. It's a 5-year case. Keith, had he died, he would have been another Freddie Gray, but he survived. The case against Keith Davis Jr. is entangled in Baltimore politics and political allegiances. And what has happened in the last 5 years has been on par with the neoliberal Democratic misleadership engulfing the city. Assumed to be a hack thief, a case of mistaken identity led 4 Baltimore police officers to corner Davis Jr. into a dark garage after an on-foot chase in West Baltimore. Those 4 officers let up to 44 rounds of bullets in that garage, resulting in Davis Jr. being shot 3 times. One bullet busting through his sinus cavity, shattering his jawbone into fragments. For the next 5 years, Davis Jr. would be persecuted for having survived. Davis Jr. was the first Baltimore police-involved incident since the murder of Freddie Gray in April of that same year. Managing to survive a Baltimore Police Department murder attempt, and after undergoing emergency surgery for the multiple fractures that were the result of being shot 3 times, he was sent to jail and would eventually be charged with the murder of security officer Kevin Jones. While a jury acquitted Davis Jr. of the robbery accusations and other charges, he was convicted of possessing a gun, which hadn't been fired but was found on the top of the refrigerator he was hiding behind while being shot at. The conviction was a discrepancy brought on by previous felony convictions. He was legally not supposed to be in the same space as a gun. None of the 4 officers involved were ever charged for the shooting of Davis Jr. But Davis Jr. would instead spend the next 5 years fighting a murder charge predicated by a gun found that had no evidence of ever being fired, yet was said to have been used in the murder of the security officer. There have been 5 court hearings, 4 for the murder accusation, despite hung juries resulting in mistrials. Davis Jr. is the second person in this country's history to be tried in a courtroom multiple times for the exact same case. Each new trial brought new evidence, which called into question both police testimony and prosecutor conduct in the case. To sit in the courtroom during each trial was to be astonished in disbelief. Witness descriptions did not match. Cops' courtroom descriptions did not match. The descriptions of the gun Davis Jr. allegedly used to murder Kevin Jones and other statements did not match. There was no substantial DNA evidence, and the prosecutor, Patrick Seidel, even argued against the validity of DNA evidence. During the rebuttal closing, where a sensationalized motive for the murder was made that was not offered during the trial, Seidel claimed that fingerprints are far more reliable than DNA. Among those aforementioned courtroom revelations were other gems, like learning the gun allegedly used by Davis Jr. was purchased in a gun consignment shop where cops in the city frequent. Also, defense attorneys discovered the bullets from the gun in question were missing in the evidence room. To top it all off, lead firearms examiner James Wagster, who eyeballs evidence and testifies on ballistic tool mark evidence in countless cases persecuted by the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, is legally blind. All of these things brought up during motions, hearings, and during trials were overruled and dismissed by judges, including the Honorable Judge Sylvester Cox, who did not want to set a precedent that would open the floodgates for retrials. Davis Jr. was subsequently found in February guilty and convicted of second-degree murder. The case of Keith Davis Jr. illuminates the politics that surround a Black and democratically led city like Baltimore. Furthermore, it illuminates the problems with state prosecutors. Prosecutors are cops. They are a driving force of not only mass criminalization, but incarceration as well. So while we discuss the powers that will be allowed to police through programs like Operation Relentless Pursuit, we must also discuss that in the event that citizens survive these state murders attempts, it is the prosecutors who actively jail us. Prosecutors yield unprecedented and unparalleled levels of discretion, including charging and bail. And as we've seen in the case of Breonna Taylor, the decision not to charge. Prosecutors are not interested in truth, justice, or community safety. They are interested in convictions. And where Baltimore City is concerned, prosecutors such as Marilyn Mosby protect the same police officers in a city where dissent decree, a spy plane, and Operation Relentless Pursuit convictions. Sorry, guys.
And I just want to encourage everyone, there have been a lot of questions in regards to the content that we're discussing. Please pay attention to the chat and involve yourself in the chat. I thank you for your attentiveness in our discussion that we've been having on today. I'm learning a lot. I'm just so encouraged by Baltimore. Vanessa, did you have anything to add for Erica, or shall we go to the questions? Because I know Angelyn has some questions that we've already have on the table.
I think, yeah, I forgot to just say that Erica Caines is also with, Black Alliance for Peace Baltimore and Ujima People's Progress Party. But yeah, we can take some questions unless Erica had a couple more things she wanted to say.
Okay,
no, I'm
Erica.
sorry, guys. I also wanted to mention that I'm an editor for Hood Communist as well, Hood Communist blog. So that's what most of the articles that I'm linking in the chat you can find on Operation Relentless Pursuit, and I'm going to also link the one on Keith Davis Jr.
Thank you, Erica. And I thank you for elevating the issue of prosecutorial ethics and misconduct to this conversation. And a lot of cities, especially top 25 urban cities, it's a lot of folks, community people who don't understand the power of the prosecutor. The prosecutor is so important. And if I have any Memphis people on this call, we have a prosecutor election in 2022. So I'm going to be holding your foot to the fire. And if there are other prosecutor races that are going on within the next couple of years, please elevate that to the group so that we can support you and build power in your communities. So I'm going to pass it over to Angelyn. We have one more phenomenal speaker, guys, so please hang in there with us. Angelyn.
Sure. So I want to say thank you, Erica, so much, and Vanessa, for your comments about Baltimore. And Erica, you never have to apologize when your child comes in and he needs your attention, or she needs your attention, or they need your attention. We are dealing with a situation where we've been working from home for, I think, 5 months now. It seems longer. So you never have to apologize for that. And it's going to be this authentic webinar when we have it all recorded and put up, and you'll hear his voice. So the couple of questions that we have from Carlton Mayer: who's funding Baltimore PD surveillance, public funding or private funding or both? And then the other question comes from Ujima People's Progress Party. Do we see imperialism abroad in Africa and indigenous nations as the premise for anti-imperialism and the full removal in the US? That's a big question. So we'll see if Baltimore can answer the first one, and anyone else who wants to join and answer the question about imperialism abroad and subsequently here in the US, please feel free to chime in.
Okay, so as far as the surveillance, the plane is privately funded, and then There's also, you know, at this point, even people's private, like their Ring doorbell cameras and that type of thing, there is sharing between these private cameras and the police going on as well. So I think there's a pretty intricate network of private surveillance that's getting mixed in to the surveillance that we're seeing in Baltimore.
Great. And anyone want to take on the imperialism question?
I can take it on. Thank you. Black Alliance for Peace has a campaign called No Compromise, No Retreat. And in that campaign, we sort of make those connections. We argue that domestic and global imperialism are counterparts. So anything that we see happening here domestically with us and over-policing is the exact same over-militarization that's happening globally. When it's of over 400 bases globally, that kind of mimics what we look like as colonized communities. And it's the same sort of force. And when we look at the Deadly Exchange Program, which is the program with Israel, the training with police, we could see how those sort of geopolitics are connected, that it's all sort of interconnected, and these things are not separate issues. So if you're going to be anti-police, you should as well be anti-imperialist.
Thank you so much, Erica and Vanessa. Baltimore is rocking and rolling. I'm just thrilled by what each of us are learning on this call today and the stories that we are sharing with one another. And I really hope that this is empowering you, the Seven City Collective, to go out and really start taking some action on this very day. So to round off our discussion, I am going to toss it over to Hamid of Stop LAPD. He's going to introduce himself, but I just want to brag on him a little bit. He's encouraged me a lot with these discussions, the webinar. He popped in on the Memphis call, and after the call, everyone was saying, I really want to connect with the guy in LA. So guy in LA who's rocking and rolling with Stop LAPD, I'm going to pass it to you, Hamid.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's absolutely an honor to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of this journey together and how we are building a whole culture of resistance on a national level. Again, my name is Hamid Khan. I'm with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Been organizing in LA for about 30, 35 years, and this more recently over the last 10 years with this coalition, looking at how increasingly counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics are being incorporated into daily policing. Of course, nothing new. It's been going on for years and years and years, particularly post-Vietnam. But I think this whole advent of technology and the movement and information sharing has added a whole new dimension and a layer to where we are. A lot of history was shared. Thank you so much, Yvonka, and also Alex and other folks as well, because the way we build our work is also that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. I mean, this is something that has been circling around for the last 300-400 years, and Yvonka was talking about slave patrols. But I'm also reminded that in 1707, there were also, or 1706, there were these lantern laws as well in New York City, which were basically laws that if you were an enslaved person and you were walking without the master, you had to walk with a lantern in your hand to self-identify yourself as a threat, as the other. So basically, surveillance has always been the tip of the knife. Surveillance and keeping an eye on suspect bodies. That was the first piece for slave patrols to first of all make sure that everybody's in their place. Constantly keeping an eye on numbers, constantly keeping that data going. So when we talk about data and when we talk about surveillance, this is not just something post 9/11 or with the Patriot Act or even with COINTELPRO, because we need to go back to recognizing that this is as old as policing has been, or even controlling of the body has been. Talk about red squads going back in the late 1800s, which were one of the first local law enforcement agencies. And I think that's why it becomes really crucial that local law enforcement agencies proceed with their surveillance tools and methodologies way before there was even federal COINTELPRO or any of the federal agencies. Chicago Police Department was the first one in 1888 to form these covert operations, went into Philadelphia, New York, LA, and the rest is history. So in the interest of time, I'll just keep it very, very brief. I think the question is that where do we go in this current moment? And I think we have to look at it in the broader context of the movement building and the rebellions and the uprisings that are going on right now. So how the Police Executive Research Forum and the International Associations of Chief of Police and the various police unions are coming together, and how are they reconfiguring where they're going to sit in there? What is the role of COVID, and how the whole landscape of syndromic surveillance and serological surveillance and sentinel surveillance and contact tracing is adding additional layers to these things as well. What is the federal and local partnership when we think about militarization of police, how that is expanding and what shapes is that taking as well? So I think these are the questions that we have in front of us, and as we build this culture of resistance and as we build our power, this is something that we need to incorporate on the day-to-day level, that how these things are going to move. I'm just going to show quickly a couple of things that how we're looking to share the work, from Los Angeles. So this is just a mapping of the LAPD's architectural surveillance, and this is how, as part of the national group, we are coming into and as partners, and to be very clear, that not to parachute into anybody's local scene, but to share, but to do that knowledge exchange. And our goal is to really decolonize a whole lot of this knowledge that exists, but it hovers at a much higher level. A lot of the national organizations claim to just own this information, whether it's the ACLU and other, and it really never goes out to our bases. It never really goes out to our information. So what is our role as organizers to bring this information? So this is just all the human-based and technology-based surveillance operations. And I think when we talk about militarization of policing, it becomes really crucial that while a lot of times the focus is on tanks and grenade launchers and the equipment, but it's the day-to-day operation, the day-to-day deployment of military technologies that is so critical. So, so here is also a quick snapshot of each one of these that is listed here. It comes from the battlefronts of Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East. Whether it's Stingray, whether it's digital receiver technology, whether it's trapwire, whether it's freedom on the move, or high definition cameras, license plate readers, even body cameras have their origins on battlefront cameras that military people wear on their helmets as well. So we have to think about it both in a cultural context too, that who's the hostile and who's the threat. And all of these things are rooted in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So intelligence gathering becomes a key piece. So I think it is imperative that for us on a local level to do that research, to do a deep dive, and it's not going to come by passing ordinances, because we reject that notion that surveillance should be legitimized. That is absolutely something that we do not, just partner with. So it has to be our own deep dive. It has to be a people's research. It has to be built based upon a lot of information, because where this is headed is into this much broader information sharing environment, which we have called the stalker state, that how information moves from the public sector to private sector to law enforcement agencies, even NCTC, which is the National Counterterrorism Center on a global level. We were talking about imperialism and having all these bases. So how these 5 eyes and 9 eyes and 13 eyes, which are like literally eyes, which are just really very much rooted in the old white supremacist settler colonial states, that how they share information. So how does Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, England, and then when you bring Israel and now increasingly India into the equation, and the things that are being developed in China, we're looking at a pretty massive architectures and the information sharing environment that is coming back to haunt us. And then last thing I want to share and just kind of make a couple comments is that this is where a lot of this information is moving. This is where it comes into the current moment, that as we are talking about divestment, as we are talking about scaling of policing, as we are talking about taking away the staffing, we have to start looking at what the role of surveillance is going to be, how the panopticon effect is going to take place, and how, for example, if there's a reduction on foot patrols, to start giving stop and frisk and start filling out FI cards, field interview cards, which are literally the primary source of building these databases. We're looking at social network analysis, that how information and what are people doing. So in a sense, For example, in Los Angeles, the police department can legitimately take on fictitious personas and fake identities to engage people in social media. So there's a lot of entrapment and a lot of that stuff going on. So I think lastly, I would end by saying that as we expand into this roadmap to recovery, and as we expand into, because COVID is a reality, and it's here to, at least in a very tragic way, I would say that it's here to stay for a minute. So how this contact tracing and how these various forms of surveillance are establishing a new layer of information sharing as well. So I think that's where I would stop, and I would love to hear what folks have to say. That when we think of militarization, when we think of surveillance, when we think of the current moment, these federal and local partnerships, along with this public-private partnership of persistent surveillance systems, of John and Laura Arnold Foundation into funding these things, into various other private monies coming in. So we have to do a much deeper look at an analysis that where is this thing headed, and it all points to gentrification. It all points to banishment of communities. It all points to development. It all points to this salivating over this prime real estate that still exists in our communities, are living there. So what is going to be what is going to happen to public housing projects and various other things as well? So we gotta decenter a lot of these things and bring in capitalism and settler colonialism together as well. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Hamid, for sharing those graphs and also doing the forecasting for us to really just share where this thing is headed, the journey to where all of this is headed, and really dismantling those systems who have oppressed us for so long. And when I say us, I speak in terms of Black and brown and also poor people. So it's very important to understand where this is headed and not be caught up in the present, because you have a lot of people who may argue to say, you know, we need the police. The police are doing a great job because my city has a lot of crime. And when you think about this fear mongering that's going on in a lot of cities, we have to, as organizers, really take that task to educate folks on where it could go. And I thank you so much, Hamid, for really laying that out for us. So I want to say thank you to all of the speakers. We had over 100 people participating in this webinar today. And I can say that as of now, we've been able to keep that base very steady. And I believe that's due to the speakers engaging with the participants through chats. Thank you so much for doing that, reaching out and touching the folks who were engaging in this discussion. And even if you weren't on this panel today, this does not take away from disrupting the intentional work that you are doing in your own cities. I believe that we have a couple of moments for questions, so I'm going to pass it to Angelyn. And even if we weren't able to voice, or you weren't able to voice your questions or comments on today, I want you to know that they are still with us, and we will do our best to be able to answer those questions. So Angelyn.
Sure. So there's a question from Ty Alston, and the question is, how do we create a financial/budgetary crisis to stop ORP? So if anyone wants to take that on. And don't speak up at once. We've got
yes, this could be anyone in any city. I guess I'll start with just Memphis because I just received a comment with how you can support in Memphis. And thank you to everyone. I'm really encouraged by the people who are just now finding out about this. It's almost kind of like when I found out about it a month and a half ago, I just wanted to jump on it. So in Memphis, I'll definitely put my email down. We are organizing together different groups of many different backgrounds. We're moving in waves. So our first wave will be education. So similar to what we're doing right now, education, virtual town halls. Some of us are doing radio interviews. So that's the first step. And then the second step for us would be that visibility. So attending a county commission meetings or being able to sit in on those virtual meetings. And then we're going to be a little bit more aggressive in our tactics. So if you are interested in connecting with us in Memphis, we're moving in strategies and waves, and we will welcome you with open arms. So if anyone else wants to talk about how they can be involved in their city, and I also saw a comment that there, even if you're not a part of the 7 cities under ORP, there are, I bet you, similar pursuits that are going on in your community. So I'm going to toss it to whoever.
Right, and someone asked about Ujima, I believe. Do we know what cities might be part of phase 2? And as you just said, Joia, it's possible that it's not specifically labeled ORP, it could be labeled something else. But it could also be that, you know, if they get the funding and they see movement, they will try to go to other communities. And I think what Joia spelled out in terms of just going to various meetings and, you know, as virtual as you can to just find out what they're talking about, I think is going to be the way that you start moving into learning more about what's going on in your jurisdiction and then taking action from that.
Can I answer that about the phase 2? That I don't even think it's phase 2. So when I looked up what's listed in 2020 as the most dangerous cities, the top 25, Albuquerque is actually part of the top 12, and so so there's other cities that were not targeted in this that were in that top 12, which is Rockford, Illinois, Stockton, California, Little Rock, Arkansas, St. Louis, Missouri, and Birmingham, Alabama, which is actually listed as the 3rd dangerous city in America. So if that was the 3rd, St. Louis is the 5th. They're not listed. Little Rock, Arkansas is number 8. Stockton, California is 10. And Rockford, Illinois is 11, and they're not listed. So I wonder if there was a reason that they were not listed, or if they are part of the other that's phase 2 of this, since they're part of the top 12.
It would be helpful, Yvonka, if you could put that list or send me the document so we can make sure everybody has that, because it's probably that they're coming to those areas soon, and they just utilize the funding that they had, that they knew they were going to get, to funnel it to these, you know, those really high crime areas.
I think it's also that cities that are more accommodating to the Republican Party, like our police department actually was very open about their support of Donald Trump during the last election in 2016. They not only were very supportive, but that was like the first time ever in history I've known a police department to actually endorse a candidate. Like, police departments don't endorse presidential candidates, but in Cleveland, our police department openly endorsed Donald Trump. So, you know, I think that there are some things around that too. What is their engagement around their party?
Right, and also, Yvonka, I want to mention too, when you brought up the conversation of the cities and what cities fell on or didn't fall on, because I know a lot of people mentioned Chicago and St. Louis and other cities that we kind of hear, I call them first 48 cities. Some people say that why weren't they included in the 7-city collective? I believe that you also have to keep in mind law enforcement has to be receptive, and the DA's office have to be receptive for those types of funds. So it could be certain cities turn down those types of initiatives or the deployment of the funds into their areas. Now, I could be wrong, but I definitely know that a city has to cooperate with the federal government in order for initiatives like that to be launched in their particular city.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Sure, Hamid.
Yeah, so I think it's also something to be kind of keep our eyes open to, that it doesn't necessarily have to be that cities have to be explicitly listed. It's also what are the current arrangements that are in existence that can then bring in other areas into that fold as well, depending on the size of the municipality. So for example, there's about 56 or 57 joint terrorism task forces. around the country. So now within each one of those task force are various municipalities that are kind of weaved in that work together. So it some are named, some we may not even know, but they are part of it. So I think as we move forward, as we build, I think that would be also something to critically keep an eye on, that what shapes these task forces are taking and who would be kind of weaved into that.
Definitely. So I have a couple of other questions. The letter that Alex referred to, we'll make sure that it's in the resources, because I understand that the link is not taking you directly to the sign-on page. So we'll make sure that everyone receives that. The other question from Emmanuel Campbell: are there litigation efforts happening in your communities challenging ORP? And I don't know if anyone can answer that.
I know that we have a standing case with the ACLU of several protesters who have joined in regards to surveillance in 2016, when we were also protesting against the brutality when it comes to Freddie Gray and Michael Brown and different cases like that happened in Ferguson. So this is an open case that we have with the ACLU. I'm sure there are other cities that mirror this, because the ACLU has been speaking with other cities and other protesters who've been having the same issues in their communities.
So a lot of the other comments are coming through chat, and I think some folks are answering those, so that's great. We will make sure that all of these resources are available to everyone. There's been a lot that's come out in this webinar, which is really, really exceptional. So thank you all.
Right. Thank you so much, Angelyn, and all of our panelists for interacting with the attendees who attended on today. We want to keep up with our time, and I really hope that you guys understand that as we adjust to this new way of socializing and convening, that just because we weren't able to call on you to speak, you were still in this space, in this sacred space. And we hope that with this knowledge, you will go out and run and tell people to join the 7 city collectives and connect with us and really share what's going on in your area in regards to press, developments, updates. I want to say a huge thank you to Laura and Judy for bringing us all together and really placing those call to actions out there from city to city. Thank you to all of you for staying the course. Again, good afternoon, good morning to some of you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Joia and Angelyn.
Free Keith Davis.
Everybody, free Keith Davis.
Thank you, Davis.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.